there's something most people don't know about Itachi Uchiha, and it has almost nothing to do with the battles you remember him for. It has to do with when he was born and what the world looked like at that exact moment. Because Itachi didn't arrive in a time of peace. He was born during the Third Shinobi World War, a conflict that swallowed entire villages, that turned children into soldiers, and that left scars on an entire generation of the ninja world. And that detail isn't just background, it's the whole foundation of who he became. When Masashi Kishimoto sat down to design this character, he didn't start with the power or the eyes or the tragedy that would come later. He started with a boy who saw real death before he was even 5 years old. Not a story about death, not a lesson about death. The actual thing, the destruction, the bodies, the fear witnessed with his own eyes while he was still small enough to be carried. So think about what that does to a child. Most kids grow up learning the world is safe and only slowly discover that it isn't. Itachi learned the opposite, and he learned it far too early. That's why, later in his life, he didn't just dislike war as some abstract idea, the way a politician might talk about peace from a comfortable chair. He hated it deeply, personally, because for him, it was never a concept, it was a memory, and that single early exposure quietly shaped every major decision he would ever make. But here's where his story starts to feel almost unfair. A boy that traumatized by violence you might expect would grow up broken or slow or hesitant. Itachi grew up the opposite. He walked into the academy and graduated at just 7 years old, top of his entire class. By 8, he had already mastered the Sharingan, the very eyes his clan was famous for, something most Uchiha spent years struggling to awaken. And by the age of 10, he had become a Chunin, a ranked, certified ninja, trusted with real missions, while other children his age were still learning the basics. By every measure the ninja world had, Itachi was a prodigy, not a talented kid, not promising, a genuine once-in-a-generation genius. And normally, that's where a character like this becomes predictable. The gifted warrior who loves the fight, who lives for the next battle, who defines himself by how strong he is. But what's really surprising comes next, because Kishimoto did something unexpected with him. He took the most lethal young genius in the entire story and wrote him as a pacifist, not reluctantly, not secretly. At his core, Itachi valued peace over power. He had every tool imaginable to dominate others, and what he actually wanted was for the killing to stop. That's a strange thing to build into a character whose hands were capable of ending a life in seconds. The more dangerous he became, the less he wanted to use it, and that contradiction, that's not an accident. It's the entire point of him. Kishimoto has openly said that Itachi was one of his favorite characters to write, and the reason he gave is telling. It wasn't the strength, it wasn't the mystery, it was precisely this contradiction, a gentle person forced into an incredibly violent role. A boy who wanted quiet, handed a life of bloodshed, someone soft at heart, wearing the mask of someone terrifying. For a writer, that tension is gold, because it means every scene with him carries a second meaning underneath the surface. So when you go back and watch Itachi now, knowing all of this, the character changes. The calm expression isn't coldness. It's a person holding something painful, very still. The reluctance in his eyes isn't weakness. It's someone who understood exactly what violence costs because he'd seen the bill paid in front of him as a child. Everything about him was built from the very beginning on that one design choice, a boy shaped by war who spent his whole life trying to protect others from ever feeling it. That's the secret hiding at the root of Itachi Uchiha. Long before the famous decisions, long before the sacrifices people still argue about today, there was a creative decision on a page. Make him a genius, make him gentle, and let those two things pull against each other for the rest of his life. And once you understand that the peace-loving heart came first and the deadly skill came second, the rest of his story stops being confusing and starts to make a quiet, aching kind of sense. What very few people realize is that Sasuke Uchiha was never really a separate story from Itachi's. He was the reason Itachi's story existed at all. Every choice Itachi made, every sacrifice, every lie was quietly built around this one younger brother. And the creator, Masashi Kishimoto, understood something important early on. To make that bond feel real, he needed a single small gesture that could carry the weight of everything unspoken between them. So he gave Itachi a habit, a two-finger poke to Sasuke's forehead. At first, it looked like nothing, a gentle tap, almost teasing, the kind of thing an older sibling does without thinking, but that little motion was doing careful emotional work. Whenever Sasuke would ask Itachi to train him or to spend time with him, Itachi would refuse, but he'd soften the refusal by leaning in, tapping his brother's forehead and murmuring, "Forgive me, Sasuke," another time. The rejection stung less because it came wrapped in affection, and because the manga returned to that same image again and again, the poke stopped being a small habit and became one of the most emotionally loaded gestures in the entire series. To this day, for millions of fans, that single motion defines the whole relationship. Here's where the design of Itachi's character becomes almost unbearably clever, because the man doing the gentle forehead poke is the same man who murdered his entire clan in a single night, and then looked his little brother in the eye and told him he wasn't even worth killing. He tortured Sasuke's mind, forced him to relive their parents' deaths, and deliberately made himself into the most hateful figure imaginable. On the surface, it's the setup for a classic villain, the cold older brother, the monster in the family. But nothing about that surface was true, and this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. Everything Itachi did to make Sasuke hate him, the massacre, the cruelty, the psychological torment, was underneath an act of protection. He wasn't trying to destroy his brother. He was trying to save him. The Uchiha clan had been planning a coup that would have plunged the village back into war, and Itachi, a pacifist who had already seen too much death, was forced into an impossible position: betray his village or betray his family. So he chose a third, heavier path. He carried out the mission himself, but he spared the one person he couldn't bring himself to kill. And then he did something that shows just how far ahead Kishimoto was plotting. Itachi decided that if Sasuke had to grow up in pain, that pain should at least make him strong. So he gave his brother a purpose: hate me, grow powerful, and one day come for revenge. Itachi fully intended to die by Sasuke's hand. That was the plan from the beginning. He wanted his younger brother to strike him down, be celebrated as the man who defeated a legendary criminal, and take his place as a hero of the Leaf Village. Every awful thing he did was a gift disguised as a wound, which is what makes Itachi such a remarkable piece of writing. Most stories build toward a villain reveal the moment you learn the kind character was secretly cruel. Itachi's arc runs in the exact opposite direction. The more you learn about him, the more the cruelty dissolves, and what's left underneath is something closer to pure selflessness. His reputation as a monster was itself the sacrifice. He let the whole world, including the brother he loved most, believe he was evil, because being hated was the price of keeping Sasuke alive and giving him a future. And this is why that forehead poke lands the way it does. When Itachi finally faces Sasuke for the last time, dying on his feet, bleeding, using the very last of his strength, he doesn't attack. He reaches out one more time, taps his brother's forehead the same way he did when Sasuke was a child, and says, "Forgive me, Sasuke, this is it." The gesture that had softened 1,000 small rejections becomes his goodbye. The same two fingers, the same words closing a loop that had been quietly building since the very first time we saw them together. So when people call Itachi a villain, they're only describing the mask he chose to wear. Beneath it was a boy who loved his brother so completely that he was willing to be despised for the rest of Sasuke's life, just so that life could continue. And once you see the poke for what it truly was, an apology, a promise, and a farewell all folded into one small motion, the brutality of his story gives way to something gentler, sadder, and unmistakably kind. The story of Shisui Uchiha begins, fittingly, in the shadow of the very man we've been talking about, because to understand Itachi at all, to understand why he made the choices he made, why he carried so much weight so quietly, you first have to understand the person who stood beside him before any of it happened. Shisui was Itachi's closest friend, the one who shared his fears and his hopes for the village, and it was Shisui's death, more than anything else, that quietly set the entire tragedy in motion. What makes Shisui remarkable, though, is not simply that he was Itachi's friend, it's what he could do. Shisui possessed a genjutsu called Kotoamatsukami, and by almost any measure, it stands among the rarest and most powerful techniques ever recorded in the entire series. This wasn't an illusion you could break by focusing your chakra or something you'd notice and resist. Kotoamatsukami could reach into a person's mind and guide their choices without them ever knowing they'd been influenced at all. They would believe every decision was their own. It was, in a sense, the perfect technique, and Shisui intended to use it for something gentle. He hoped to quietly steer the Uchiha away from their planned coup, to prevent a war before it ever started, without a single life being lost. But here's where the record turns cruel. A technique that powerful is also a technique worth stealing. Danzo Shimura, a man obsessed with protecting the village through control, wanted that eye for himself, and he took it. He stole one of Shisui's eyes, seizing Kotoamatsukami before Shisui could ever use it the way he'd planned. And so Shisui, robbed of half his sight and half his hope, faced an impossible calculation. His second eye was still intact, and he knew Danzo would come for it too. So rather than let that power fall into the wrong hands a second time, Shisui made a decision that would echo for the rest of the story. He gave his remaining eye to Itachi, entrusting his closest friend with the one thing he had left. And then he threw himself off a cliff, ending his own life on his own terms. It's a quiet, devastating moment, and it carries a detail most people overlook. That single act of loss is precisely what awakened Itachi's Manekyo Shuriken. Think about what that actually means. Itachi's most iconic power, the eyes that would later let him wield Tsukuyomi and Amaterasu and Susanoo, didn't come from training or ambition or some grand battle. It came directly from grief, from the death of the one person he trusted most. In the lore of the Uchiha, the Mangekyou can only awaken through the trauma of losing someone close, and for Itachi, that someone was Shisui. His greatest strength was, quite literally, built out of his deepest loss. And yet, the most unexpected part is still to come, because you'd assume that once Shisui was gone, his gift simply became Itachi's, a transplanted eye, nothing more. But that isn't what happened. Shisui's eye kept functioning for Itachi long after Shisui himself had died, remaining active and useful across years of the story. In a world where transplanted Shuriken often come with heavy costs and instability, this quiet continuity is its own kind of statistic, a friend's eye still doing its work, still protecting decades of narrative time after its original owner was gone. That eye would go on to play a role that Shisui, at the moment he fell, could never have foreseen. Years later, during the Great War, the influence tied to Shisui's power resurfaced at a crucial moment. The technique he'd hoped to use for peace finally reaching the outcome he'd always wanted, long after he could see it happen. In a very real sense, Shisui was still shaping events from beyond, still guarding his friend, still nudging the world toward the gentler ending he'd died trying to reach. So when you look back at the whole of Itachi's story, the massacre, the exile, the silence, the sacrifice, it helps to remember that none of it began with hatred. It began with a friendship and with a young man who cared so deeply about preventing bloodshed that he was willing to give up his eyes, his power, and finally his life to make it possible. Danzo took what he could, but Shisui made sure the most important part went to the one person who would carry it honorably. And that quiet handoff, that final act of trust between two friends, is where everything Itachi became truly starts. Behind the familiar appearance of Kisame Hoshigaki, there was a truth that ran opposite to almost everything his reputation suggested. When Itachi left his village behind and stepped into the shadow world of the Akatsuki, he was assigned a partner. That partner was Kisame, a towering swordsman from the hidden mist, a man whose very presence seemed built to inspire fear. On paper, this looked simple. Two criminals, two rogue shinobi, thrown together by an organization that trafficked in violence. You would expect a partnership like that to be cold, transactional, held together by nothing more than shared ambition. But that is not what happened at all. What formed between Itachi and Kisame was something far stranger and far quieter. It was mutual respect, and over time, it became something that looked a great deal like genuine friendship. That is the first thing that flips the expectation. We tend to assume that villains only tolerate each other, that alliances between dangerous people are always fragile and always self-serving. Yet these two walked together for years, and in all that time, there was almost never friction between them. They trusted one another, they covered for one another, and when they spoke, there was an ease to it, the kind of ease that only exists between people who have stopped pretending. The contrast between them was deliberate. Masashi Kishimoto designed the pair to be visually opposite in nearly every way. Kisame was enormous, broad, shark-like, his skin tinted blue, his teeth sharpened, carrying a massive bandaged sword nearly as tall as a person. Beside him stood Itachi, slender, still, calm to the point of seeming detached, his movements economical and his voice low. One was a storm you could see coming from a mile away. The other was silence. Placed side by side, they became one of the most memorable duos in the entire series, and that was no accident. The visual tension was the point. It made you look twice, and it made you wonder what these two very different men could possibly have in common. The answer is where the story turns quietly inward, because beneath the surface, they were far more alike than anyone watching would have guessed. Both men had grown deeply disillusioned with the villages that raised them. Both had come to see the systems they once served as hollow, built on lies, sustained by cruelty dressed up as duty. Kisame, in his own way, had grown to distrust the entire idea of the shinobi world, a world he believed was drowning in deception. Itachi carried a secret so heavy it had cost him his family and his name. Neither of them said these things out loud to each other in any grand way. They did not need to, and here's what almost nobody knows. The reason their partnership worked so well was precisely because both of them were hiding something. Most people assume that secrets drive others apart, that they build walls between people. But for Itachi and Kisame, the opposite was true. Each recognized in the other a man carrying a weight he refused to explain, and rather than prying, they simply respected the silence. They understood, without words, that some burdens are not meant to be shared, only acknowledged. That quiet recognition was the foundation of everything between them. Kisame himself once said that he and Itachi were alike, and when you look closely, it is hard to argue. Two powerful shinobi, both extraordinarily skilled, both walking a path that separated them from the world they came from, both keeping the deepest parts of themselves locked away. They moved through the story side by side, two of the Akatsuki's most feared members, and yet the thing that bound them was not their power, it was the loneliness underneath it. They were two men who had each decided in their own way that the world had lied to them, and who found in each other the rare comfort of not having to explain why. This is the counterintuitive truth at the heart of their partnership. We are conditioned to believe that the antagonists of a story are simply obstacles, interchangeable threats without inner lives. But Kisame was never that. He was a man of conviction, however dark that conviction became, and he chose to stand beside Itachi with a loyalty that never wavered. In a series full of dramatic betrayals and shifting alliances, their bond remained steady from beginning to end. So when you picture Itachi in those Akatsuki years, you should not picture him alone. There was always a shadow beside him, enormous and patient, a partner who understood him better than most of the people who claimed to love him ever did. If you look closely at Madara Uchiha, you start to notice something that most people miss on a first watch. Itachi never truly trusted him. He worked beside him. He shared plans with him. He let Madara believe they were partners in the same design. But underneath all of that calm cooperation, Itachi was quietly building walls against the very man he pretended to follow. And the strange thing is, the tool he used to do it was something that looks purely decorative. His crows. Everyone remembers the crows. Whenever Itachi appears, They scatter out of him. They fold into genjutsu. They let him slip away when he should have been cornered. It feels like a signature, a bit of style, but the crows were never just style. In Japanese folklore, the crow is not a bad omen the way it often is in the West. The crow, and especially the three-legged crow, called the Yatagarasu, is a sacred guide, a messenger of the gods sent to lead people through difficult ground. So when the writers gave Itachi crows, they were quietly telling you what he really was, a hidden protector, steering events from the shadows, guiding a story nobody else could see. Now here is where the happy accident comes in, the lucky twist that changed everything without anyone noticing at the time. Itachi had a friend named Shisui Uchiha, a man whose eye held one of the most dangerous powers in the entire series, the ability to control another person's mind so completely that they never even realized they had been touched. Shisui died to keep that power out of the wrong hands, but before the end, one of his eyes reached Itachi, and instead of using it, instead of keeping it for himself, Itachi did something that only makes sense if you assume he was already thinking many moves ahead. He hid that eye inside a crow. Then he took that crow, the one carrying Shisui's eye, and he placed it inside Naruto, not Sasuke, not himself. Naruto, the one person Itachi believed would always be near his brother when it mattered most. It looked like a throwaway moment. It was almost forgotten, but that single quiet act was a fail-safe, a last line of defense in case Sasuke ever fell under Madara's control. If the worst happened, that hidden eye could be used to break the spell and pull Sasuke back. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Think about what that decision actually tells you. Itachi was working inside the Akatsuki, standing shoulder to shoulder with Madara, agreeing to his plans, wearing the same cloak. To everyone watching, he was a loyal piece of Madara's machine. But the crow inside Naruto proves the opposite. Itachi trusted Madara only as far as he absolutely had to, and no further. The whole time, he smiled and cooperated. He was secretly preparing a weapon aimed straight at Madara's greatest ambition: the control of the Uchiha bloodline, the control of Sasuke. This is the contrarian point that most people slide right past. We tend to imagine that Itachi was simply used, that he was a tragic pawn moved around a board by older and colder men. But the crows tell a different story. They are physical proof that Itachi never surrendered his own judgment. He gathered information, he kept secrets, he planted countermeasures, and he did it in plain sight, disguised as loyalty. The man who looked like a follower was quietly the one setting the traps. So the crows stop being an aesthetic the moment you understand them. They become a symbol of a mind that refused to stop calculating, even when everything around it demanded surrender. Itachi wove them into his genjutsu, yes. He used them to escape, yes. But he also used them as living hiding places, carrying secrets that could outlast his own death. And that is exactly what happened. Itachi died believing the plan was over, believing he had spent his last breath, yet the crow remained, the eye remained, the failsafe remained, waiting quietly inside Naruto for a future Itachi would never see. And when that moment finally arrived, it changed everything, just as he had hoped it might. A gift from a dead friend, hidden inside a bird, planted inside a boy. A small, easily missed decision that turned out to be one of the most important safeguards in the entire war. That is who Itachi really was, not a man who trusted Madara, but a man who quietly outthought him, protecting the village from the shadows, several moves ahead, even long after he was gone. People rarely talk about Nagato when they think about the moment Itachi truly slipped free, but the two are connected in a way that runs deeper than most people notice. To understand how Itachi broke the unbreakable, you first have to understand the world that shaped both of them, because the technique that saved Itachi didn't come from him at all. It came from a chain of people who had already passed on, and that chain quietly reached all the way back through the war itself. During the Fourth Great Ninja War, Itachi was reanimated by Kabuto using the Edo Tensei technique. This was the same forbidden jutsu that had already turned so many fallen legends into puppets, dragging them out of death and forcing them to fight for a side they never chose. Itachi was no exception. His body was restored, his eyes reopened, and he was pointed at his own allies, made to move against everything he had died protecting. But here is where Itachi becomes something no other reanimated ninja ever managed to be. Every other summon under Kabuto's control stayed a prisoner, their wills locked away behind his commands. Itachi did not. In the middle of the battle, he broke free of Kabuto's control entirely, something the technique was never supposed to allow. And he didn't do it through sheer strength or willpower in the moment. He did it because of a plan he had set in motion long before he ever died. That plan takes the shape of a crow. Years earlier, Itachi had implanted a crow inside Naruto's body, and that crow carried a single eye belonging to Shisui Uchiha. Inside that eye lived Kotoamatsukami, one of the rarest and most powerful genjutsu in the entire world, a technique capable of controlling a person's mind without them ever realizing it. When Kabuto tried to seize Itachi's will, the crow emerged from Naruto, the eye activated, and Kotoamatsukami turned inward. Instead of controlling an enemy, it freed Itachi from the outside force gripping his mind, and in an instant he was himself again, standing in the middle of a battlefield with his own thoughts restored. And this is where the connection to Nagato quietly appears, because that same Shisui, that same longing to protect the village through unseen means, ran through both of their stories like a thread. But what's really surprising comes next, because being free was only the beginning of what Itachi intended to do. Once he had his own mind back, Itachi turned toward the real problem. Breaking free saved himself, but it did nothing to stop the Edo Tensei that was still tearing through the war, so he chose to end the threat at its source. He used a technique almost no one had ever seen, a forbidden jutsu called Izanami. Izanami is a strange and precise thing. It does not blind or destroy like its counterpart. Instead, it traps its target inside an endless loop, a cycle that repeats over and over until the person caught inside finally accepts who they truly are. Only that acceptance can end it. Itachi cast Izanami on Kabuto, and Kabuto, a man who had spent his entire life running from his own identity, borrowing pieces of others, wearing the skin of stronger ninja, was suddenly forced to sit with the one thing he had always avoided. He was made to confront himself, and in doing so, the loop pressured him toward the only exit it offered, which was to finally stop, to accept his own self, and to release the very technique he had used to imprison the dead. So think about what actually happened here. Kabuto had reanimated countless legends, and the shinobi world had struggled against them across the entire battlefield. Yet the one person capable of truly stopping him was a man Kabuto himself had dragged out of the grave. Itachi, dead, summoned against his will, turned into the single weapon that could unravel Kabuto's entire strategy. That is the quiet lesson buried in all of this. Even in death, even stripped of his freedom and pointed at his own allies, Itachi remained the only person who could truly bring Kabuto to a halt. His planning outlived his own body. The crow, the borrowed eye, the technique waiting silently for years, all of it was set in place before he ever fell, and all of it still worked long after he was gone. It's the same pattern we saw before, a man several moves ahead, protecting the village from the shadows, trusting nothing to chance. And once again, when everyone else could only react, Itachi had already prepared the answer, leaving it hidden inside himself, waiting for the exact moment the world would need it most. Curiously enough, Naruto Uzumaki was never meant to be the center of Itachi's plans, and yet he became the truest measure of everything Itachi ever hoped for. Because when you trace Itachi's legacy, you don't find it carved into monuments or written in village records. You find it living quietly inside a boy he barely knew, the one he chose to carry his final wish for peace. Itachi had spent his life keeping his real intentions hidden, so it makes sense that his most important gift would also be entrusted, not announced. He handed Naruto a fragment of his own power and a piece of his hope, trusting a near stranger with the thing he cared about most, and that trust wasn't random. Itachi had watched from a distance how Naruto refused to give up on Sasuke. He saw someone who could reach the brother he could no longer protect himself. So when the two finally spoke in what became their last real conversation, Itachi did something unexpected for a man defined by silence. He admitted his own mistakes. He confessed that he had gotten things wrong, that he had tried to shape Sasuke's path alone and failed, and then he told Naruto a truth he had never once allowed himself to follow, that no one should carry everything by themselves. Sit with how strange that is. Here was a man who bore an entire massacre in secret, who let the world brand him a traitor, who accepted being hated so completely that even his own brother wanted him dead. That man looked at the story's hero and told him to do the exact opposite of what he himself had done. Don't shoulder it alone. Don't disappear into your burden. Lean on the people around you. It was less advice than confession, the regret of someone who understood, too late, the cost of solitude. And Naruto absorbed it, that single idea, strength shared rather than strength hidden, quietly reshaped how he saw his entire role, right when the war was about to demand everything from him. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because Itachi's influence didn't stop at words spoken to Naruto. It reached backward into the wound that had started everything. His dying moment with Sasuke has become one of the most quoted scenes in all of Naruto, and not because of any grand speech. Sasuke had chased this confrontation his whole life, expecting a monster. Instead, at the very end, Itachi pressed his fingers to his brother's forehead, the way he had when Sasuke was small, and said the words people still repeat today. Then he was gone. It was only later, during their final farewell, that he would tell Sasuke he never had to forgive him, and that no matter what he became, he would always love him. The tension in that scene is almost unbearable, because Sasuke didn't yet know the truth. He thought he had killed the man who destroyed his family. So the resolution comes later, and it lands like a reversal of everything the audience assumed. The revelation that Itachi had been a double agent, that he slaughtered the clan under orders to prevent a civil war, that he chose to be hated so his little brother could live. The truth didn't just clear Itachi's name, it detonated the entire foundation of Sasuke's revenge. And here's the contradiction that makes it work. You would expect a truth that terrible to break Sasuke completely, to send him further into darkness. For a time, it did. But over the long arc of the story, that same truth became the thing that pulled him back. The hatred that had defined him slowly turned into something else, a promise to protect the village his brother had died protecting. Revenge, the emotion that fuels most tragedies, was quietly converted into guardianship, and the person who made that conversion possible never lived to see it. That's the part worth pausing on. Itachi is often remembered for his power, for the genjutsu and the crow and the impossible calm, but his real legacy is structural. Naruto's story is, at its core, about breaking the cycle of hatred, the endless chain where pain creates revenge, and revenge creates more pain. And the invisible force that finally severs that cycle is a man who died believing he had failed. He set his hope inside Naruto. He set his love inside Sasuke, and both took root long after he was gone. So when everyone else could only react to the war unfolding around them, Itachi's answer was already in motion, carried by a boy he trusted, aimed at a brother he loved, working exactly as he had hoped, at the precise moment the world needed it most. Originally, Danzo Shimura was never meant to be remembered as the man behind the massacre. In the memory of most fans, he stands as the villain who wiped out the Uchiha, a shadow behind a single, unforgivable command. But the truth is far more tangled than that simple picture, and the more closely you follow it, the more it begins to resemble a famous glitch in the story's moral machinery, a mistake so heavy that it became iconic. The Uchiha, you see, were genuinely planning a coup. This was not paranoia invented to justify a slaughter. The clan had been pushed to the margins of the village they once helped to build, and their resentment had hardened into a plan to seize power by force. Itachi, still a teenager, understood exactly where that road ended: civil war, and beyond it, a foreign invasion into a weakened leaf. So he did something no order could have forced him to do. He went to Danzo of his own initiative, because he feared that war more than he feared his own damnation. And here the story turns, because what happened next was not a command at all. It was a bargain. Danzo did not simply point Itachi at his clan and send him out like a weapon. The two of them struck a deal. Itachi would erase the entire Uchiha bloodline with his own hands, but only if Danzo swore, in return, to spare one life, Sasuke's. That single condition is the hinge on which the whole saga turns. Without it, there is no younger brother left alive to protect, no reason for Itachi to keep living as a hated criminal, no one for him to shape his every remaining choice around. The most emotional relationship in the series exists because of a clause in a negotiation with the man everyone loves to hate. Kishimoto built Danzo very deliberately to carry that weight. He was designed as the embodiment of the ugly pragmatism of the Hidden Leaf's founding generation, the part of the village that believed peace could be bought with quiet cruelty. He was meant to be the counterweight to Hiruzen, the third Hokage, whose idealism always reached for a gentler answer. That is why these two old men are constantly at odds over Itachi's fate, one arguing for mercy, the other for the knife. They are two halves of the same broken system, and Itachi is caught precisely between them. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come, because Danzo did not only manipulate the Uchiha, he fed on them. His right arm, kept hidden beneath bandages for most of the story, was grafted with the 10 Sharingan harvested from the slaughtered Uchiha, stolen eyes that let him borrow their power. Woven into that same arm were cells taken from Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage himself. Together, those two sources let Danzo wield Izanagi, a forbidden jutsu that allows its user to rewrite reality for a few moments and simply refuse to die. So the man who preached that the village must be protected at any cost was quietly cheating death, using the stolen strength of the very clans he spent his life exploiting. Uchiha and Senju alike, the two founding bloodlines, bent into a single desperate trick to keep one old schemer breathing. But every one of those eyes came at a price, because each use of Izanagi burned one Sharingan closed forever. So Danzo's survival was a countdown, 10 lives spent one blink at a time. He had turned other people into extra chances, and he knew the moment he ran out, death would finally catch up. And it did, in the most fitting way the story could offer. The man who had used Itachi as a weapon of peace, who had traded a boy's soul to prevent a war, was himself struck down in the end by Sasuke. That is the bitter irony, sitting at the center of it all. The one life Danzo had promised to spare, the brother Itachi bargained so hard to keep breathing, grew up to become the blade that ended Danzo's own. Every Sharingan in that arm went dark, one after another, until there were no more second chances left to steal, and the founder of the Leaf's darkest shadow finally fell to the very survivor his mercy had created. So the villain everyone remembers turns out to be something stranger, not a monster who forced a tragedy, but a pragmatist who negotiated one, and who was undone by the single life he agreed to leave alone. A mistake that became a legend, and a bargain that quietly shaped everything that followed. One often overlooked detail about Hiruzen Sarutobi is that his name itself carries a quiet piece of Japanese folklore. Sarutobi Sasuke was a legendary ninja from Japanese children's stories, a monkey-like trickster hero of the Sonata 10 Braves, and Kishimoto borrowed that name on purpose. So when you hear Sarutobi, you're hearing an echo of centuries-old folk tales, and it's no accident that Sasuke Uchiha shares that same borrowed name. But that hidden reference sits under a much heavier truth about the man who carried it. Hiruzen spent years trying to solve the Uchiha crisis the slow way, through negotiation. He believed a village should hold itself together with words before force, so he kept reaching for a diplomatic answer that never came. But every path he tried closed, and it was his failure to find one that pushed a 13-year-old Itachi toward an impossible choice. The kindly grandfather of the village, the man who taught and protected generations, could not talk his way out of this one. That's the part people misread. Because Hiruzen looks like the gentle old leader, viewers assume he must have ordered the massacre, or at least allowed it willingly. But he never wanted it. He was overruled and outmaneuvered by Danzo, who moved behind his back to make the extermination the only remaining option. So the tragedy didn't come from a villain twirling a mustache. It came from a good man being outplayed inside his own government, and the guilt of losing an entire clan on his watch haunted him for the rest of his life. That's a deliberate choice by Kishimoto, and it's worth sitting with. He built Hiruzen as the warm pipe-smoking grandfather figure, the emotional anchor of the leaf, so his quiet complicity in the massacre reframes the whole Uchiha story. It stops being good versus evil. It becomes a chain of terrible compromises where decent people agreed to smaller and smaller evils until a child was killing his own family in the dark. But here's what almost nobody knows. Even after the massacre, Itachi didn't simply vanish. Itachi had one condition buried inside his sacrifice, that his little brother Sasuke be spared and protected, so that wish was honored in the shadows. Itachi kept watching over Sasuke even after fleeing the village as a wanted criminal, having secured his brother's safety through his own private threat. The man the world called a clan killer was quietly allowed to remain his brother's distant guardian. Think about the strangeness of that. The official story said Itachi was a rogue who slaughtered his family and abandoned the leaf. The real story said the same rogue had quietly ensured the one survivor would be protected. Both were true at once, so the lie the public believed was built on top of a mercy that only a handful of people knew about. That mercy came at a terrible cost to Itachi's name, though, and this is where timing turns cruel. The truth was meant to be protected, kept sealed until it was safe to reveal. But Hiruzen died during the Sand and Sound invasion of the Leaf, killed by his former student Orochimaru before the full truth could ever be told publicly. So the one man best positioned to eventually clear Itachi's record was gone. And because he was gone, Itachi's name stayed blackened for years longer than it needed to be. There was no elder statesman left to quietly set the story straight, no trusted grandfather figure to say there was more to it than you were told. So the boy who had given up everything, his clan, his reputation, his place among the living, was remembered simply as a murderer. The secret that might have redeemed him died with the old man in that invasion. It's a strangely human tragedy for a story about ninja and eye powers, a leader who tried diplomacy and failed, a compromise he never wanted but couldn't stop, a private mercy carried out in the dark, and a death that arrived at the worst possible moment, sealing a good man's shame in place. So when you go back and watch Hiruzen in his gentle scenes, teaching, joking, protecting the village he loved, there's a weight under all of it. He carried a folk hero's borrowed name, Sarutobi, the leaping monkey of old Japanese legend. But the real legend he left behind wasn't heroic in the simple way. It was the quiet, aching kind, the story of a man who negotiated a tragedy, tried to soften it in secret, and ran out of time before he could ever make it right. And that unfinished mercy is what shaped everything that came after. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Itachi's crow, because the more you look at it, the more you realize the bird was never just a stylish accessory. Kishimoto chose it on purpose, and the choice reaches all the way back to Itachi's name. In Japanese, Itachi means weasel, an animal tied in old folklore to bad luck and ill omens, a creature that supposedly appears right before misfortune arrives. So from the very first syllable of his name, this was a character designed to feel like a warning, a signal that something dark was on its way. And once you understand that, the crows stop being decoration and start being an extension of the same idea, because in Japanese culture, crows carry a specific meaning. They're seen as messengers that move between the world of the living and the world of the dead, birds that gather where death has already happened. So when you place that symbolism onto a man who is quietly carrying the weight of an entire massacre, the crows almost write themselves. He's a person surrounded by the deaths he caused and the deaths he couldn't prevent. Therefore, the story wraps him in the one animal that traditionally belongs to that space between endings and beginnings. The imagery isn't random. It's built to tell you what he's holding long before he ever says it out loud. But here's where it gets more interesting than most viewers ever notice, because Itachi didn't just use crows for atmosphere. He used one as a weapon he never intended to fire. During his final confrontation, he places a crow inside Naruto, and that crow is hiding something extraordinary: Shisui's living Sharingan, the eye of his closest friend, planted as a secret failsafe. The idea was simple and cold and completely in character. If anyone ever tried to force Sasuke into becoming a weapon against the leaf, that hidden eye could activate and stop it. So even in death, Itachi was still setting traps to protect the village, still thinking several moves ahead, still trying to guard the people who never knew he was guarding them. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting, because the crows quietly foreshadow the double life he was living the entire time. Think about what a crow looks like when it appears in fiction. It reads as an omen, a villain's shadow, a black-feathered sign that the antagonist has arrived. That's exactly what Itachi is supposed to look like for most of the story. So the flock works as misdirection. It tells the audience and the characters that this is a dangerous man, a bringer of ruin, someone to fear. But the truth underneath is the opposite. The bird that signals a villain is secretly attached to the one person who is protecting the very village that condemned him. The omen was never an omen. It was camouflage. There's a reason that image stuck so hard too. His crow-based genjutsu lets him fill an entire sky with hundreds of birds at once, turning the air itself into a swirling black curtain. That single visual became so iconic that it's now almost inseparable from the whole Uchiha aesthetic. When people picture the clan, they often picture that storm of feathers, that overwhelming flood of crows blotting out the light. So a symbol that started as a quiet piece of folklore ended up defining the look of an entire bloodline, all because it fit one man so perfectly. Now here's the angle that makes the crow even richer, because some of the meaning we read into it comes from ideas that shifted over time. The fail-safe crow, the hidden Shisui eye, feels like a perfectly planned masterstroke, but it also fits a pattern in how Itachi's character kept being reshaped. He was originally introduced as a straightforward antagonist, a genius who slaughtered his family and walked away without remorse. That was the first version the audience was handed. But as the story deepened, that cold villain was rewritten into something far more tragic, and the crow quietly absorbed every new layer. The bird that once just meant menace slowly came to mean sacrifice, memory, and protection, all stacked on top of each other. So the crow becomes a kind of record of the character himself. It begins as an omen, a name that means bad luck, a shadow that looks like a threat, but it ends as a symbol of hidden mercy, a messenger carrying a dead friend's eye and a living brother's future. The same black bird that was meant to scare you turns out to be the gentlest thing in his entire design. A quiet guardian wearing the costume of a warning, watching over a village that never knew it had been forgiven. There's something most people don't know about Amaterasu, and it starts not with fire, but with a name. When Masashi Kishimoto sat down to design Itachi's most terrifying technique, he didn't reach for something random. He reached into the oldest layer of Japanese belief. Those black flames that pour from Itachi's left eye are named after Amaterasu, the Shinto sun goddess, the highest deity in the entire Japanese pantheon, the one from whom, in legend, the imperial line itself was said to descend. So when Itachi whispers that name, he isn't just casting a jutsu, he's invoking the sun. And that choice matters because the flames are described as burning as hot as the sun itself, a black fire that behaves less like ordinary combustion and more like a piece of a star brought down to earth. But a name like that carries weight, and Kishimoto understood the rule behind it. The technique ignites wherever the user's eye focuses. You look at something, and it burns. There's no dodging a gaze, and once it's lit, it cannot be put out by any normal means. Water won't stop it. Smothering it does nothing. In the mythology of the series, Amaterasu is said to burn for 7 full days and 7 full nights before it finally exhausts itself. So on paper, it sounds like the perfect weapon, unblockable, unquenchable, eternal. Except it isn't perfect, and this is where the design turns quietly cruel. Every time Itachi uses those flames, his own eye pays for it. It bleeds, his vision dims. Little by little, the very power that lets him see his target is stealing his ability to see anything at all. The sun he commands is also the sun that blinds him. And that's the detail that reveals how carefully this was built, because Amaterasu was never meant to stand alone. Kishimoto paired it with an opposite. In Itachi's right eye lives Tsukuyomi, a technique named after Tsukuyomi no Mikoto, the moon god of the very same Shinto tradition. So think about what that means. One eye holds the sun, the other holds the moon. Itachi's 2 Mangekyo Sharingan abilities aren't just 2 attacks. They are the 2 great celestial deities of an ancient mythology, split across a single face, the sun that burns and the moon that traps the mind in illusion, a god in each eye. But what's really surprising comes next, because that slow blindness isn't a flaw in the writing. It's the entire point. The Mangekyo Sharingan was designed from the ground up to be a curse dressed as a gift. The more you use its greatest powers, the more your sight fades, until eventually the world goes dark. And that single design decision is what shapes the whole tragedy of the Uchiha clan, because there is a way to escape the blindness. There is one method to restore the light and gain an even greater power, and it is monstrous. You take the eyes of a sibling, a brother's eyes, a sister's eyes, the clan's endless hunger, the thing that turns family against family. All of it grows out of this one rule Kishimoto wrote into the technique. The gift and the curse were always the same object, which makes Itachi's own relationship to Amaterasu so much heavier than a battle scene, because he understood exactly what it cost him, and he still chose how to use it. In his final act, dying and already half blind, Itachi didn't cling to that power. He passed it on. During his last moments with Sasuke, he planted Amaterasu inside his younger brother, not as a memory and not as an inheritance to be proud of, but as a hidden trap, a trigger quietly set to activate against Tobi, the masked man who intended to use Sasuke for his own ends. So the flames named after the sun goddess became in the end a shield left behind, a weapon buried in his little brother's eye, waiting silently, ready to protect him from a threat Itachi could no longer face himself. And that's the quiet genius of the whole thing. On the surface, Amaterasu is the scariest fire in the story, inextinguishable, unstoppable, hot as a star. But when you trace it back to its origins, back to the goddess it was named for, and the choices Kishimoto layered into it, you find something gentler underneath, a technique built to blind its owner, wielded by a man who was already giving up his sight, spent at the very end, not to destroy, but to guard. The sun that burned for 7 days and 7 nights passed from a dying brother's hand into the eye of the one person he loved most, still watching over him long after the light in Itachi's own eyes had finally gone out. What very few people realize is that Izumi Uchiha never appeared in the original Naruto manga at all. She wasn't part of Kishimoto's early vision for the massacre, and for years, readers simply assumed Itachi killed nameless clansmen in the dark. But when the novel Itachi Shinden was written to expand his backstory, the writers introduced her deliberately, a childhood friend, a girl who quietly loved him, added not for spectacle, but to make the tragedy feel personal. So Izumi exists almost entirely because someone decided the massacre needed a human face, a single name you would remember long after the crowd of victims blurred together, and the choice of who she was matters. She wasn't a warrior or a rival. She was gentle, ordinary, the kind of person who noticed Itachi when he was still just a boy carrying too much weight. Her feelings for him were never dramatic or loud. They were the quiet, patient kind, the sort that waits years without asking for anything back. So when the writers placed her at the center of that final night, they weren't just adding a death. They were adding the one death that would hurt the most. Because here is the detail that reframes everything. On the night of the slaughter, Itachi didn't save Izumi for last. He killed her first, but he didn't do it the way you'd expect from someone the entire village would come to call a cold-blooded murderer. Before she fell, he caught her in Tsukuyomi, the genjutsu that bends time inside a single glance, and inside that illusion, he gave her an entire lifetime. She lived years married to him, grew old beside him, experienced a whole quiet future that never existed, all in the space of a few seconds, all before her body ever hit the ground. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. Think about what that actually means from a writing standpoint. The creators had a choice. They could have made Itachi's first kill brutal, quick, a clean signal that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Instead, they wrote the opposite. The boy everyone believed was a monster took the time, in the middle of murdering his own clan, to gift his victim decades of imagined happiness in her final heartbeat. It's a contrast built on purpose, the gentlest possible act hidden inside the worst possible night. So the scene doesn't tell you Itachi was cruel. It quietly insists he was the opposite, even here, even now. There's another small piece the expanded material added, and it fits the Uchiha pattern almost too perfectly. Izumi's Sharingan didn't awaken through training or ambition. It awakened the moment she witnessed her own father's death. That's not a random detail. Throughout the entire series, the Uchiha eyes are tied to loss and love. They evolve through grief, through the pain of watching someone precious slip away. So by giving Izumi that same awakening, the writers weren't just handing her a power, they were marking her as truly one of them, bound by the same sorrow that shaped Itachi himself. But the deepest reason she exists has nothing to do with her Sharingan or the illusion or even the massacre itself. Izumi was written to answer a question fans had argued about for years. Was Itachi's kindness ever real, or was the gentle brother just a mask over a killer? And her story settles it quietly. A person capable of that final mercy, capable of loving someone enough to soften even their death, was never cold at heart. The massacre was not who Itachi was. It was only what he believed he had to become. So Izumi becomes the proof, the single thread of evidence that the peaceful boy underneath was there the entire time. That's what makes her one of the most unusual additions in the whole story. Most characters are created to move a plot forward, to fight, to reveal, to complicate. Izumi does almost none of that. She appears, she loves, and she dies in the opening moments of a night the reader already knew was coming. But her purpose was never to change events. It was to change how you understand the person carrying them out. So a character invented years after the fact, in a novel most casual fans never read, ended up quietly reshaping the emotional weight of the entire Uchiha tragedy. And in the end, that's a strangely fitting legacy for someone like her, a quiet girl, easy to overlook, who loved a boy the world would learn to fear, remembered not for what she did, but for the single moment of tenderness she was given inside the darkest thing he ever chose to do. The story of Tsukuyomi begins, fittingly, with a name borrowed from the heavens. In Japanese mythology, Tsukuyomi is the god of the moon, a deity born alongside the sun goddess Amaterasu, the two of them siblings separated across the sky. Kishimoto chose that name deliberately because Itachi's two greatest techniques mirror that same pairing. Amaterasu, the black flames of the sun, and Tsukuyomi, the silent illusion of the moon. So before the technique ever does anything, its name already tells you what it is: the quieter, colder half of a divine pair, the sibling that works in shadow rather than fire. What Tsukuyomi actually does is deceptively simple to describe. It is a genjutsu, an illusion cast through direct eye contact that drags a single victim into a world Itachi completely controls. Inside that world, he governs three things: time, space, and mass. He decides how long a moment lasts, where the victim stands, and how heavy their own body feels against them. But here is the detail that catches almost everyone off guard, the record that makes the technique so unsettling. To the person trapped inside, the ordeal can stretch across 3 full days of unbroken torment. In the real world, outside the illusion, that entire experience lasts 1 second, a single tick of a clock. 72 hours of suffering compressed into the time it takes to blink. That compression is the whole point. Itachi never needed to hold someone for minutes or hours. He needed 1 instant of eye contact, and in that instant, he could deliver something the mind experiences as days. So the technique isn't powerful because it lasts a long time. It's powerful precisely because it doesn't. The brevity is the weapon. Kishimoto gave the illusion a look as distinct as its function. Everything inside Tsukuyomi is rendered in 3 colors only: red, black, and white. The sky inverts, the world drains of everything else, and that stark palette becomes a visual signature. So when readers or viewers saw those colors bleed across a panel or a scene, they understood instantly what had happened before a single word was spoken. Someone had met Itachi's eyes, and they were no longer in the real world. It's a quiet piece of visual storytelling, a shorthand that let the audience feel the dread, a full beat before any character explained it. And yet, the most unexpected part is still to come, because the true measure of Tsukuyomi isn't found in an ordinary victim. It's found in one of the strongest ninja in the entire series. Kakashi Hatake is called the Copy Ninja, a man who had reproduced over 1,000 techniques with his own Sharingan, a veteran who had survived wars. When Itachi turned Tsukuyomi on him, Kakashi didn't merely lose the fight. He was left comatose, carried away unconscious, his mind so overwhelmed by that single second that his body simply shut down. So the technique's reputation wasn't built on nameless enemies. It was built on the fact that it broke a legend, and broke him almost instantly. That one encounter did more to establish Itachi as a monster than any threat he ever spoke aloud. But the strangest truth about Tsukuyomi is that the technique itself was never the cruelty. The same illusion that shattered Kakashi's mind, the same power that could turn 1 second into 3 days of agony, was the exact tool Itachi used to give Izumi a gentle death. He didn't crush her or torment her. He placed her inside Tsukuyomi and let her live an entire lifetime with him in the space of a moment, a full life, a peaceful one, ending quietly of old age, all before her body fell. So, the technique was only ever as cruel as the person wielding it. In the hands of an interrogator, it was torture. In that one hand, for that one person, it became mercy. That contrast is what makes Tsukuyomi worth remembering. On paper, it's a genjutsu with 3 rules and a strange time signature. In practice, it's a mirror held up to the man casting it. The record it holds, days of experience folded into a single second, sounds like the perfect instrument of horror, but the record that matters is the one nobody expects. That the most fearsome illusion in Itachi's arsenal was also the vehicle for the kindest thing he ever did. Time, space, and mass all bent to his will, and the most surprising use he ever found for that godlike control was to give one quiet girl a peaceful place to say goodbye. Behind the familiar appearance of the memorial stone, there is a name that almost wasn't allowed to be there at all. For years, the hidden leaf remembered Itachi Uchiha as the worst kind of traitor. He was the boy who had wiped out his own clan in a single night, the criminal whose name was spoken with fear, the shinobi every hunter in the village would have been proud to bring down. By every official record, he was a mass murderer. So when you look at the stone that honors the fallen heroes of Konoha, the last name you would ever expect to find carved into it is his. But that is exactly where his story ends. After the truth of his sacrifice was finally revealed, that he had killed his clan under orders to stop a civil war and protect the village from itself, Itachi was posthumously exonerated. The very leadership that had once condemned him now recognized him as a hero of the Hidden Leaf, and his name was cleared from the massacre he had always been blamed for. The man history had recorded as its greatest villain was quietly rewritten as one of its greatest protectors. That reversal is complete, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it flips everything. The boy branded a clan-killing traitor is now honored on the village memorial. The shinobi the entire world was taught to hate is remembered as one of Konoha's most loyal sons who ever lived. He spent his life making sure that no one knew the truth, that his brother would hate him, that the village would revile him. So the strange result is that the more loyal he actually was, the more of a monster everyone believed him to be. His reputation and his reality were perfect opposites. And here is where it gets even more surprising, because you might assume a character built entirely on being misunderstood would be a hard one to love. The opposite turned out to be true. Kishimoto has said that Itachi is his favorite character to write. Fan polls taken again and again over the years consistently rank him among the most beloved figures in the entire series. What makes that remarkable is how little time he actually spends alive on the page. Compared to the heroes who carry the story from beginning to end, Itachi's living appearances are brief, so by every ordinary measure, he shouldn't be this popular. But here's what almost nobody knows about how deep that affection runs. The audience didn't just want more of him. The creators gave them more. Itachi's story grew so large in the minds of readers that it spawned its own spin-off. The Itachi Shinden, a set of novels later adapted into their own anime arcs, dedicated entirely to the character, and the purpose of those stories is telling. They exist to fill in the years of pain that the main series only ever hinted at, the missions no one saw, the choices no one understood, the loneliness he carried in silence, so the very details he worked so hard to hide became the material fans most wanted to see. The secret he took to his grave became a whole story of its own, but of everything that survives him, one small moment matters more than any battle he ever fought. In his final scene with his younger brother Sasuke, dying and out of strength, Itachi did not deliver a grand speech. He simply reached out, pressed 2 fingers gently to Sasuke's forehead, the way he had when they were children, and told him that this time would be the last. And in that quiet gesture came the line that would outlive him, that there was no need to forgive him. He asked nothing. He explained nothing. He only offered peace. Those words became one of the most quoted, most echoed moments in all of Naruto. Fans return to that forehead, poke over and over, and its meaning only deepens once you know the truth behind it. Because the man asking to be released from forgiveness had done nothing that truly needed forgiving. He had carried the guilt of a crime he committed for love. So the most heartbreaking thing about that moment is that he still believed, right to the end, that he had wronged the person he was actually saving, and that is the counterintuitive heart of it all. Itachi Uchiha spent his entire life ensuring he would be hated, and in doing so, he became one of the most loved. He erased his own honor to protect a village that only honored him once he was gone. The memorial stone remembers a traitor who was, in truth, the most loyal one of all. If you look closely at Kotoamatsukami, you realize how much of Itachi's plan rested on something that almost looks like luck. Kotoamatsukami was the crowning power of Shisui Uchiha's Mangekyo Sharingan, one of the most powerful genjutsu ever shown in the series. It could enter a person's mind and rewrite their choices so gently that they never felt controlled at all. But by the time Itachi needed it, Shisui was already dead, and one of his eyes had been stolen by Danzo. Itachi only managed to recover the other, so he carried that single eye like the last piece of a friend, and instead of using it for himself, he saved it for someone else. That decision leads to something most fans miss about Itachi's final gift to his brother. In their last real moment together, He pressed 2 fingers to Sasuke's forehead and said, "Sorry, this is the last time." On a first watch, it sounds like nothing more than a goodbye, but it wasn't only that. In that touch, Itachi was secretly implanting a failsafe, Amaterasu, inside Sasuke's own eyes, hidden where no one would think to look. He said goodbye with his words, but with his hands he was leaving a shield, and that shield had one very specific purpose. The technique was set like a trap, dormant and waiting. It was designed to activate automatically the very moment Tobi tried to take control of Sasuke through the Sharingan. Itachi couldn't be there to protect his brother forever, so he built protection into Sasuke himself. It's an almost accidental kind of foresight, one man planting a countermeasure against a threat he could only half predict, quietly guarding his little brother long after he himself was gone. And that leads to the biggest twist of all. When you step back and see the whole shape of it, everything Itachi did starts to line up, killing his own clan, letting Sasuke grow up hating him, even planning the moment of his own death. All of it was engineered toward one outcome. He wanted Sasuke to grow strong, and he wanted Sasuke to be seen as the hero who avenged the Uchiha and restored the clan's honor. The tragedy was the tool, the hatred was the fuel, and the goal underneath all of it was love. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. You might expect that a brother who sacrificed so much would want Sasuke to follow in his footsteps, to carry the same burden, to know the same truth. But Itachi wanted the opposite. This is the counterintuitive part that reverses what you'd assume. He never actually wanted Sasuke to become like him. He deliberately hid the truth, precisely so that Sasuke would kill him out of clean, simple hatred. Itachi believed that a Sasuke driven by clear purpose would be safer and happier than a Sasuke crushed under the full ugly weight of what really happened. So he chose to be misunderstood on purpose, because being hated was easier for his brother to carry than being pitied. That belief is also why the goodbye, poke to the forehead, lands so hard. It wasn't a new gesture. It was the same small touch from their childhood, the thing Itachi did whenever he was too busy to keep a promise, a quiet way of saying next time. So when he does it one final time and says, "This is the last time," he's using an old symbol of affection as the delivery method for both his apology and his hidden gift, a brother's love, disguised as a final dismissal. It became one of the most quietly devastating callbacks in the entire series, because the meaning only fully opens up once you know everything he was hiding. And that hiddenness was intentional not just for Sasuke, but for the reader too. Kishimoto has said in interviews that Itachi became one of his personal favorite characters to write, and the reason is telling. Almost none of Itachi's true motives are visible on a first read. On the surface, he's a villain, a clan killer, a man who tortures his own brother. It's only on the second pass, once you know the truth, that every scene quietly changes meaning. The cruelty becomes protection, the distance becomes care, the coldness becomes the deepest kind of sacrifice. So the strange, almost lucky beauty of it is this: a borrowed eye, a childhood habit, a hidden technique, and a lie told out of love, all of it folded together into a single plan that looked, from the outside, like the story of a monster. And only later, looking back, do you see it was the story of the most loyal brother of all. And so we close this journey through the world of Naruto, where every secret and quiet truth led us here. to Itachi's final gift, the Kotoamatsukami. Thank you for wandering these stories with me as sleep drifts in softly now. Let these tales carry you gently into the dark. Sweet dreams.